And the title, of course, is realizing the potential of the global talent pool. And we all know there is a global talent pool. And it's been created by enabling technology and legal and regulatory changes. And the question is, how do you take advantage of the opportunity? And I don't have an answer to that, but there are some things we need to think about. When you talk about a global talent pool, you can either bring the talent to you, or you can go to the talent. That's the meaning of setting up a subsidiary in some other country. You've gone to the talent or to the opportunity. You can bring people here or to wherever here is if you have a visa route. If you don't have a visa route, then, as all of us have encountered, this grand scheme stumbles at the first hurdle. And this again becomes a political issue as much as it is a matter of economic calculation. And if you do either of these things, there are issues that might happen. If you go there, you're vulnerable if something goes wrong. We've just seen that with the supply chains. If we build up all these locations everywhere because they're close to the natural gas or the labor is cheaper or whatever, what happens if you can't ship? All of a sudden, everything breaks down. So the issue of the fragility of globally extended networks is very important. And remember, we're not talking about only intellectual products. We're mainly talking about physical products and things that actually have to be moved. If you bring talent to you, then you have interesting effects on a local society. And we heard earlier that immigrants are often not welcomed, especially large numbers of immigrants. And so one of the consequences of bringing in talent is that it irritates people, even though in some objective sense they're all better off because the famous pie is now bigger, but they have this deep suspicion that their slice of it will shrink and someone else will get more of that bigger pie. And again, without some thoughtful social interactions, that's exactly what happens. If you come from India and you become a very successful programmer in the Silicon Valley, you make an awful lot of money and you enter the upper stratum of success, and the people who are not in that stratum aren't doing very well, not least in the Silicon Valley. So, you know, anti-immigrant hostility, sometimes it's bigotry and sometimes it's from recognizing that immigration allows governments and private enterprises to avoid the need for upskilling. So these are all fundamental issues that I don't want us to lose sight of as we think through these very interesting structures and technological opportunities. And since people are giving me that look, I'm now going to shut up. And we'll have, in this sequence, Amelia, Raveen, and then Gina to give a couple of comments, and then we're hoping to get questions and issues from the audience because they're only going to talk for 2 minutes each and there'll be a prolonged period of silence if you don't say anything. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, George. I'll jump in if I may, and Raveen, what I'll do is I'll try to make a seamless next step from your excellent lecture. In fact, I'm going to quote verbatim, if that's all right, so that should please you greatly. So you talk, of course, and have written on the boundaryless ecosystem, and I was really very struck by that. Start with the work, as you said, and I think the type of new work arrangements are increasingly multifarious. There's a whole spectrum of types of workers and work, and you list a couple, and I'll list them now. Obviously, contractors and freelancers and volunteers, but also gig workers, and the sense of really project-driven posts. And I think when you map that up internationally, there are a variety of risks. And again, these are sort of cautionary tales. Here I've got my other hat on, not the politics hat, but the sort of Dean International hat, in which we bring a lot of researchers and new employees into the university, but we have to be, you know, very, very aware of the shifting talent pool that we're looking for, project-based or whatever, and of course some of the very real issues that we face. The first one, of course, is actually time, starting too late, leaving too late, the types of rules and requirements, the use of interpreters, even things like working across time zones. So we had one that went badly astray simply because somebody couldn't count, you know, +7, and we lost somebody in Singapore. So it sounds, you know, trite, but it's really not. No, absolutely. So I think organizations can be caught short, I think, by failing to take those particular actors into account, and then you get rushed hiring decisions, which are really difficult, and you get sort of underqualified or just maybe qualified but unsuitable employees, which are much more, you know, tricky to deal with. There's of course a whole host compliance issues. You think it's complicated just working in your national market. Obviously, you can double or triple those sorts of problems in terms of international aspects as well. So just for interest's sake, taxes, leave entitlements, benefits, wages, pensions, workplace health and safety, termination and probation periods, those alter country by country. And then it gets exquisitely difficult if you're looking at the European Union, which is beginning to harmonize on some areas, but not on others. So that makes it doubly difficult. So you need to understand and comply, obviously, with the relevant laws of the region and relevant laws of the state that you're looking at. And you really need to be on top of changes to the laws as well. What may exist in January 2022, particularly in terms of pensions, in one particular country is not nearly what you might find in another, and that may mean the offer you make is simply not valid, not worthwhile. There's the issue, I think, of misclassifying the type of worker that you're looking for, and this is something I'm particularly interested in because we've done it before. You need to be clear about their employment status. Not necessarily the job description itself, but their status as an employee. The obvious one is, are they an employee or are they a contractor? Is it full-time, is it part-time, is it sessional, etc. You don't want to misclassify an international employee as a contractor in order to sort of work around a tax liability, which I think happens all the time anyway. And the law, I think, generally looks at the nature of the relationship between an organization and a worker to determine the worker's status. Rather than a label. So I think that's something key. Two final ones. It's more the sort of cultural context to which you have to be very sensitive and very aware of, not just hiring international local workers in terms of language barriers or expectations, etc., but everything you've just said today. You're talking about the most mobile, the most flexible, the most hybrid of ways in which we simply identify people as workers on the basis of the types of projects. So you want to value diversity, but you don't want to be, in a sense, sort of tripped up by the practicalities of them. And then the final one, of course, is where are you? Permanent establishment criteria. Right. Are you willing to base yourself, in another country in order to primarily open that talent pool? In which case you're liable to tax. Do you want to actually sort of just reach in and scoop up and sort of have a hub and spoke effect? So the organization, think carefully about whether you want to have a fixed place of business there. How long has that organization been based there? How emphatic are you about regularly conducting business in a particular place in order to be able to say we're prepared to take the quantitative knocks in order to get a sort of qualitative talent pool? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Amelia. That's really helpful and I think really important considerations. I wanted to take a sort of a different tact as we, George, you made the point about the collective versus the individual, which I think is a really important one. When we think of individual companies and how we tap the global sort of talent pool, increasingly, given the labor shortages that we're all experiencing, what we've seen with many of our clients around the world is certainly rethinking compensation, rethinking benefits, the level and the mix of benefits. So bending the supply side of the curve, if you will, in addressing that. But also, I think more and more organizations, coming back to my earlier point about work design, really needing to become a core capability of our organizations with HR leading the way. How do we bend the demand curve of work? Anyone who's ever hired a data scientist knows that they spend about 60% of their time doing data cleaning. That's a lot of time on a really low value added activity for a talent pool that's incredibly scarce. And so what we've seen organizations do is to say, instead of needing 20, can I get away with 10 because I'm going to remove all of the data cleaning from your job description and use an algorithm for that. And thus actually free you up to do what you came into this profession to do all along, which is to code and write powerful code and baking in time for you to keep getting better at that. This notion of, space for well-being and learning in the flow of work. So something I think we need to think about long and hard is how do we bend the demand curve of work as well through better work design? I do think, those three models I talked about, those nuances are going to be incredibly important for all of you to educate your businesses on, because everyone's really comfortable with the model on the left-hand side. Figuring out what can and should move to the one in the middle versus the right, and doing so in a judicious way. The tech bit is the easiest thing. I think it was Tom who talked about the overselling from some of the tech vendors. And they do, they always oversell the benefits, they always undersell the challenges of implementation, and they never sell the change management, which all of us have to deal with. And the change management could not be more profound because, again, we're reversing 140 years of learned behavior and muscles that our leaders have developed. From a collective perspective, though, I do think it's fascinating to see how things have evolved. And I want to just pick on two models as a compare and contrast. So I do a lot of work with the Skills Future initiative in Singapore, which is a very collective model based on how Singapore is planning the next 25 years, of which industries it's going to go after. That translates into a specific set of skill requirements, and then companies having an incentive to ensure their talent is upskilled, and then accessing the curriculum from NUS or whichever of the academic institutions. So a really structured collective approach. Things like that don't work particularly well in America. And instead, what we've seen, right or wrong, is organizations having to go it alone. I did a documentary series for the public broadcast service, and we talked about the need for a more collective approach to addressing these skill shortages with government, academia, and companies, because the economics work best, to George's point, when it's done on a collective basis. But what you are starting to see is frustration rise in United Airlines, just to pick on an organization I know well, opening their own flight academy. And the reason they opened it was the supply of military pilots, which has traditionally powered the airlines, has dried up. And so they need to now get young people into it. But going back to the DEI question, the thing that they've done, which is quite interesting, is to say 80% of each of their new classes are going to be women and minorities, because what we need to do is rebalance the mix of the traditional profile of the pilot, because I think there's something like 8% of all pilots are women, if that. And so shifting the mix to create a more sustainable sort of pipeline of talent. So I think George's point about the collective versus the individual is important, but I think cultural differences, structural and legal differences, I think often require us to look for some alternative solutions.
Excellent. I was just going to say their problem is going to be solved because wars have traditionally supplied the airline pilots, yes. And they look like a goodly number coming in the future, so I wouldn't worry too much about the flight academy for the moment. So having heard that, Gina, what's your perspective on all of this?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say I'm not sure how I find myself up on this stage with such esteemed colleagues, but thank you, Will, for that one. The initial brief was, could you just give a couple of comments, and suddenly I find myself here. Perhaps it's to bring a practitioner point of view. Look, so we've had a lot of conversations about work and the types of work, and certainly in the white collar and certainly in the technology. My background is industrial. I've come through the mining pit and certainly through the commodities. So a couple of the examples that I want to give are really in that more industrial type of space. But I do think that demand and supply challenges, regardless of where we are, permeate any part of the industry that we're in. And certainly the industries in which I've worked, we've always required skilled trades and skilled engineers and technicians. But often, to your point, George, bringing the people to where the work is very difficult. We work in very remote areas, very sort of inhospitable, occasionally very dangerous, and it's to assets that you can't move. Those holes in the ground don't move. The big cement kilns don't move. And so we have a challenge in the industrial space on both the supply and the demand stage. So we really need to think differently, because the demand is not going away and the supply is drying up from our traditional models. So really, what are we doing on the demand side? Well, the first side is looking at automation. So how can we automate a lot of the work that has traditionally been done by trades and non-skilled workers? But that is a long-term investment over a long period of time. A shorter-term option, and that we're trialling now across a number of our sites, is do we actually need the level of skill required for the job? And we did touch on this earlier. Do we need apprentices that have to have 4 years worth of training, or can work be done in a different way? Can you break work down? Can you train for it in a shorter time period? What is the work you're actually needing them to do?
Can you challenge the organisations that exist that determine that we need to have these qualifications? So can you work with apprenticeship boards? Can you work with the areas of business that actually determine what level of skill and how long these people need to be trained? So it's really applying a different, can work be done in a different way? Can it be automated? Can it be done by less skilled people? Can you train for it in different ways? So it's really reviewing the work skills, it's reviewing the practices and the tasks that you're asking them to do. And the added benefit to that is then an inclusion and diversity angle as well, because if you can have different work patterns, you are actually opening that supply market to you in a much different way. So your female pilots who want to work part-time, I know we've got a great example in Romania where we've simply done something like change a shift pattern from being 7 in the morning to 7 at night, because that was a way in which it was good for us to do. We've now changed it from 9 till 3, and we've opened up a whole new market of females that can come in and work for us because they can work school hours. A lot of it's not rocket science, it's just actually thinking about what we need to do. Sort of turning to the supply side, we have always had a traditional supply model in the heavy industry side. Crusty old mining engineers, those that lived life on the edge, that weren't afraid of going out to some of the new frontiers. Career expats that used to cost an absolute fortune, happy to leave family behind. But if you think about social patterns now, you've got those younger generations that are coming through. People want to live in urban areas. People don't want to leave their families. They've got dual careers. They've got carer obligations. Some might even like their spouses and hence want to be with them. So it's how do you actually think about doing work in a different way, and how do you get that? So two examples that we're working on, one on the automation side from an organisation I worked with about 8 years ago in Australia. They brought the work to an urban area. So through automation, they automated many of their mines. And what they did was set up a remote operations centre in Perth. So the young urbanites, the professionals who didn't want to go and work on site, were able to work in a city, and through remote technology and telepathy, through automation and through, yeah, that could be good actually, yeah. Through automation and visual representation and end-to-end work boards, they could control the mines from a site in Perth. And so it was a way in which that supply side was broadly opened up. So it was not only the automation side, but a greater demand and supply. And then on the other side, in terms of one of the challenges that we have on the supply side in many of the remote areas is localisation, and by that, previous models, as I've said, were expatriates going to site, but many of the governments in these remote locations don't want career expats any longer. They're looking for jobs for their local employees. And so the work that we're doing there is now, how do you localise the workforce? They don't want these white Anglo-Saxon professionals there anymore. They want work for the folks in the business. So we've been doing a lot of work around sourcing locally, breaking down the work, training up the folks, rotating them through a number of sites around the world so you can get the experience, but bringing them back home to their location. We've had good success in Mauritania, as an example. We took it down from 130 expats to 12 in a 3-year period, so there is some success there. Some of the challenges still exist. Some of the work practices in one part of the world are not allowed in another. So, for example, underground miners are not, women in underground mines in Russia are not allowed. That's just part of the culture. So we couldn't do that. And then other things are just sort of general government relations issues. So it's what you've got to do is really think outside the box. You know, what can you do about your supply side? And one of the best things that you can do is employ a government relations person to work collaboratively with the people in country and have your really good HR people there on the ground. So it's really, to your point, Raman, it's about what can you do to change the demand model and how can you open up your supply model. So that's some of the practical things that we're working on.
So if I could just ask you a question, Gina, on this, since I work in an educational institution, you've got all these people in these far-flung places who need education. Mm-hmm.
Training.
Well,
education.
Let's call it training. Elevated people like me call it education. So, but the point is they need training. Yeah. And have you thought of connecting with educational institutions or training institutions to facilitate that? Because in a sense, that's more their core business skill, mm-hmm. and you're going to have to, in effect, acquire, as you've been describing, a whole lot of new skills around trying to identify and then train people who have no don't have the background, etc., that you would expect if you were hiring people into skilled roles. So have you done any kind of exploration with educational bodies to make this easier?
So it's multimodal for us. A lot of the work is theory-based, so you can do that through educations and you can do it remote, or you can bring the training partners in. A lot of it is actually hands-on, so it's physical type of work, particularly in the sort of hourly workers. And then you've got those shorter-term apprenticeships who are working with masters, and you can either bring them in remotely and drop them in for a short gig path and then take them back out. So the folks on the ground are actually learning by either remote and theoretically, then theory, then practical, and then themselves from the masters on the ground.